The autumn of 1874 had come to the high ridges of Randolph County, with a kind of quiet that unnerved even the most seasoned men of the woods. It wasn't the soft, lazy hush of falling leaves and cooling days. It was the sharp-edged kind, the sort of quiet that presses in on you, makes you notice the beat of your own heart. The hunters in the town of Elkins knew the signs. Animals sensed something wrong before people did, and for the past week not a squirrel had chattered, not a deer had been seen, and the usual dawn chorus of birds had fallen completely silent. It was the silence that drew Caleb Ransom deeper into the forest that morning. A silence so complete that it seemed the trees themselves were listening. Caleb was a man built by the mountains, broad in the shoulders, face weathered from years of frost and sun, eyes a clear, cold blue that missed little. He was out before first light, his breath curling white in the frosty air, as he followed a narrow deer path into the hollows north of town. His boots crunched on the stiff leaf litter, each step unnaturally loud against the stillness. He had gone about 3 miles when he noticed it. The wind had stopped altogether. The treetops stood frozen against a gray sky, and somewhere ahead there was a faint rustling sound, not the skitter of a small animal, but something deliberate, careful, as though whatever made it was aware of him. He slowed his pace, shouldering his rifle, and scanned the clearing ahead. That was when he saw it, someone or something standing among the thin birch trunks. At first he thought it was a child. The figure was small, slight, pale against the dark wet earth. It wasn't moving. It wasn't even breathing as far as Caleb could tell, just watching. Its head was cocked slightly to one side, like a bird studying a predator. The hair, tangled and matted with leaves, hung nearly to the shoulders. The clothing, or what remained of it, was no more than tatters of homespun shirt and trousers, clinging in damp strips to thin limbs. Caleb called out, "You lost, boy." His voice sounded strange in the stillness, swallowed almost instantly by the trees. The figure didn't answer, didn't flinch. It only shifted its head in the other direction, like it was trying to catch the sound from another angle. Caleb stepped closer, wary now. "Where's your folks? You hurt?" Still nothing, until the boy spoke. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything Caleb had ever heard. The words came in a sudden burst, sharp and clipped, each syllable strange and staccato. The sound had an edge to it, as if it had been formed in a throat not quite human. Caleb felt a chill trace his spine. The boy's voice was flat, almost cold, and his eyes, Lord, those eyes caught the thin morning light and reflected it back like an animal's at night. They weren't just light-colored, they seemed to hold the light in them, trapping it, bending it. "I don't know what you're saying, son," Caleb muttered, though he found himself taking a step back without meaning to. The boy tilted his head again, studying him with a calm that felt older than his years. Then, as if deciding something, he stepped forward. His bare feet made no sound against the frozen ground. Caleb noticed with a twist in his gut that the boy's skin was not reddened or mottled from the cold. In fact, the frost on the grass didn't seem to cling to him at all. Caleb lowered his rifle slightly. It wasn't right to leave a child alone out here, no matter how strange. "All right, come on. We'll get you into town, warm you up, find your ma and pa." He didn't expect the boy to understand, but he gestured toward the trail. The boy stared for a moment, then walked toward him, eyes never leaving his face. Caleb turned and began leading the way, glancing back every so often. The boy followed at a steady pace, never slowing, never hurrying, never speaking another word. The walk back to town took nearly an hour. The silence between them was heavier than before, and Caleb found himself talking just to fill it, about the hunt, about the early frost, about the preacher's Sunday sermon. The boy gave no sign of hearing any of it. When they reached the first houses on the edge of Elkins, people stopped what they were doing to stare. Mrs. Hollis, sweeping her porch, froze mid-motion, the bristles of her broom hovering just above the boards. Old Mr. Ant took off his hat and muttered something under his breath as they passed. By the time Caleb reached the sheriff's office, a small crowd had formed. The boy didn't seem to notice. He stepped into the office, looked around once, then fixed his gaze on the far corner of the room, and didn't move. Sheriff Amos Hart, a man not easily unsettled, shifted in his chair as he studied the boy. "Where'd you find him?" he asked Caleb. in the hollow by Birch Creek, just standing there like he was waiting for me. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. Talks in some language I don't know. Ain't seen the like in my life. The sheriff tried his own questions. Where was the boy from? Who were his parents? But the only response was that strange, clipped language again. The words came in short bursts, and now in the close confines of the office, they seemed to make the air feel colder. Sheriff Hart frowned. Ain't any tongue I've heard, and I've heard plenty. What with all the miners coming through? Someone suggested fetching Reverend Powell, who claimed to know a smattering of native dialects from his missionary work. Powell arrived, listened for less than a minute, and shook his head. Not Cherokee, not Shawnee, not even a broken form of any I've studied. This is something else entirely. The boy's presence began to draw whispers from the crowd outside. Some swore they had never seen him before, and in a town as small as Elkins, that was saying something. A few murmured that he looked touched or marked, words that carried weight in the mountains. The sheriff, having no better option, decided to keep him in the office for the night until someone came forward to claim him. He gave the boy a blanket, a plate of bread and salted pork, and a cup of water. The boy ate without hesitation, tearing into the bread with a quiet urgency, but he ignored the cup of water until it was taken away. Caleb left the office late that evening, but the image of the boy lingered with him long after he reached home. He couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, reflecting the lamplight as he walked away. There was something in them, not fear, not gratitude, but a kind of knowing, as though the boy understood far more than he should, and was simply waiting for the rest of them to catch up. That night a frost settled over Elkins, silvering the rooftops and turning the streets slick. In the sheriff's office, the boy sat awake in his chair, long after the lamps were dimmed, his gaze fixed once again on that far corner of the room. If anyone had been there to watch closely, they might have sworn his lips moved in the darkness, speaking in that same strange tongue, but softly now, as if addressing someone just out of sight. And if they'd listened harder, they might have noticed something else, the faint sound of answering whispers, coming from where no one stood. By morning, the frost still clung to the windows of the sheriff's office, clouding the glass with delicate white veins. The iron stove in the corner clanged and hissed, its heat doing little to soften the bite of the air. Sheriff Amos Hart had spent a restless night, never fully sleeping in his chair, one eye half open toward the strange boy who sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. The boy hadn't asked for more food, hadn't spoken since the night before, and most unsettling of all, hadn't appeared to sleep. Hart wasn't the kind of man given to superstition. He'd seen his share of hardship, flood years when the river took whole families, winter fevers that emptied houses overnight, even the occasional brutality of men toward each other in the mines, but nothing he'd known fit the boy sitting quietly in front of him. The child's hair was a tangle of burrs and dirt, his skin pale as bone, yet there was no sign of illness or injury. When Hart had offered him another blanket in the night, the boy had simply looked at it, then back at him with an expression neither accepting nor refusing. Just watch. Word had spread quickly through Elkins. By the time the first light of dawn edged over the rooftops, people were already drifting toward the office. They lingered outside in small knots, their breath making brief ghosts in the air as they speculated. Could be one of them runaways from the big cities, said Mr. Durant, tugging his coat tighter. Don't look like no city child I've ever seen, Mrs. Hollis countered. There's something in the eyes, like a wild thing. You mean an animal? Someone I mean something that knows more than it ought, she replied, voice low. By mid-morning, Hart decided he needed to start the formal process of finding the boy's origin. He sent Caleb Ransom, who had found the child, to fetch the town clerk and arrange notices to be sent to surrounding counties. Descriptions would be posted: height, hair color, the peculiar gray shade of the eyes. But even as the clerk carefully dipped his pen and wrote the details in a neat hand, Hart had the sinking feeling it wouldn't matter. No one would come. Inside the office, the boy sat in the same spot, though now he seemed to take some interest in the movement outside the frosted windows. His head would turn slightly whenever a new voice called from the street. Hart decided to try again. You got a name, he asked slowly, enunciating each word. Name? He pointed at himself. I'm Hart, Sheriff Hart. Then he pointed at the boy. You? The boy's gaze shifted to Hart's face, then dropped to the sheriff's badge. For a long moment he said nothing. Then came the same strange language as before, short bursts of sound, some syllables harsh, others almost musical. Hart waited for him to finish, then shook his head. "I don't understand a word you're saying, boy. You from up north south?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he reached for a stub of pencil lying on the sheriff's desk. Hart hesitated, then handed it to him along with a scrap of paper. The boy bent over it, moving the pencil in short, precise strokes. Hart leaned forward, expecting perhaps crude drawings. What emerged was nothing of the sort. The marks were unlike any writing Hart had seen. Not letters, not even the runic scrawls some of the older German immigrants used to carve into tools and doorframe. These marks looped and angled in ways that made the eyes follow them reluctantly, as if the brain wanted to resist making sense of them. The boy finished, set down the pencil and pushed the paper back. Hart stared. "This means something?" he asked. The boy only watched him, expression unreadable. The sheriff folded the paper and slipped it into his desk. Something in his gut told him it wasn't wise to leave it lying in the open. By noon, the Reverend Powell arrived, hat pulled low against the wind. He asked to speak with the boy alone, claiming he might be able to reach him where others could not. Hart agreed, but remained within earshot. Powell began with prayer, slow and deliberate, his voice filling the small office. The boy sat motionless through it, his eyes fixed not on the Reverend but on the far wall, the same corner he had stared at the night before. When Powell tried a few phrases from Cherokee and Shawnee, the boy gave no indication of understanding. Switching to Latin from his seminary days, Powell recited a verse from the Gospel of John. That was when the boy's head turned sharply, and for the first time a faint smile touched his lip. It wasn't the smile of a child hearing something familiar. It was something colder, like a man hearing the punchline to a cruel joke. Powell stopped abruptly, his face paling. He rose, muttered something about the boy being troubled in spirit, and left without further explanation. Hart watched him go, uneasy. That evening, he moved the boy to a back room in the boarding house run by Mrs. Grady, reasoning it would be warmer and more comfortable than the office. Mrs. Grady, a widow, with a sharp tongue, agreed to keep an eye on him for a few days. The boy accepted the move without protest, walking beside Hart through the lamplit streets. People paused in their doorways as they passed. A few made the sign of the cross. Hart tried not to notice. Mrs. Grady gave the boy a bowl of stew. He took one spoonful, set it down and did not touch it again. She tried bread and apples instead. Those he ate quickly, though without any sign of enjoyment. When bedtime came, he lay down without complaint, facing the wall. Miss Grady swore he was still in the exact same position when she rose at dawn. 2 days passed without progress. The notices went out, riders carrying them to Weston, Clarksburg, and even down toward the Virginia line. No word came back. Meanwhile, the town's unease grew. First came the stories from the blacksmith, who claimed his forge fire went out the moment the boy walked by, despite being well stoked. Then the Miller twins swore they saw him standing outside their window at midnight, though Mrs. Grady insisted he had not left his room. Hart began to suspect the town was feeding on its own fear, turning coincidence into cause. But in his quieter moments, he admitted something about the boy gnawed at him. It wasn't just the strange language, or the unreadable eyes. It was the absence of anything human in his man. Children fidgeted. They laughed, cried, sought comfort. This boy did none of that. He existed in the space around others without ever seeming part of it. On the 4th evening, Hart stopped by Mrs. Grady's to check in. The boy was sitting at the small table, staring at the flame of a kerosene lamp, not just watching it, studying it, as if memorizing every flicker. Hart cleared his throat. The boy's eyes shifted to him, and for a brief second, Hart felt the room tilt, as though the space between them had shortened without either of them moving. He told Mrs. Grady to keep the door locked at night. That same night, in a cabin 3 miles outside town, a farmer woke to find all 6 of his chickens dead in their roost. There was no blood, no sign of predators. Their eyes were open, their bodies still warm. By morning the whispers had begun again, and the boy's name, though not his real one, was on every lip. No one could say where he had come from. No one could say who he belonged to. And though Hart had done his best to follow every lead, he was beginning to suspect the truth was far stranger than a lost child in the woods. The boy had no past in these mountains. The first snow of November had barely melted from the rooftops when the doctors began arriving. It was unusual for men of science to travel so far into the mountains for a single case. But word had spread quickly beyond Randolph County. Letters, sent by Reverend Powell and Sheriff Hart partly out of desperation, partly curiosity, had reached physicians in Grafton, Wheeling, and even as far as Baltimore.
The replies came back with the same undertone. There were whispers of a wild boy found in the Appalachian backcountry, a child who spoke no known tongue, and seemed unaffected by the autumn cold. For a certain breed of scientific mind, that was a summons too strange to ignore. The first to arrive was Elias Pennington of Clarksburg, a tall man with a narrow frame, spectacles perched precariously at the end of his nose. He came on horseback, his saddlebag heavy with instruments, stethoscope, thermometer, reflex hammer, and several glass vials. He stepped into Miss Grady's boarding house with the confident air of a man expecting to solve a puzzle. Thomas was sitting at the table again when Pennington entered, hands folded neatly before him, eyes fixed on the window, though the curtain was drawn. At Hart's nod, the boy allowed himself to be examined without resistance. Pennington began with the basics: pulse, respiration, skin temperature. He murmured. Unusually slow heart rate for a boy of his age, but steady. Skin, surprisingly warm to the almost feverish, yet no flush, no sweating. He noted these things in a small leather-bound book, occasionally glancing up at Thomas's face. The boy never looked back, his gaze wandering instead to a darkened corner of the room. When Pennington tried the reflex hammer, tapping lightly at knees and elbows, the boy's reactions were immediate, but strangely controlled. No flinching, no visible discomfort. He followed the doctor's movements with the calm of someone who understood the procedure perfectly, though there was no reason he should. Next came the thermometer, one of the new mercury models. Pennington slid it beneath Thomas's tongue, instructing him to close his mouth. The boy complied, sitting perfectly still until told otherwise. Pennington removed it and frowned. 98.6, precisely. Not unusual in itself, but I've been told by the sheriff this boy has been outdoors without coat or shoes in freezing temperatures, yet shows no signs of hypothermia. That is curious. When Pennington attempted to examine Thomas's ears and throat, the boy pulled back slightly, not violently, just enough to convey refusal. His eyes met the doctor's then, and Pennington hesitated. Perhaps another time, he said quietly, stepping away. 2 days later, a second doctor arrived. Dr. Andrew Kessler, from Baltimore, a man known for his work in comparative anatomy. Kessler was heavier, with a deep voice, and a manner that could fill a room even before he spoke. He brought with him not just medical tools but sheets of paper, ink, and several books in languages ranging from Latin to Russian. Kessler's examination was far more thorough. He measured the boy's height 4 feet, 7 inches, and weight 72 pounds. He noted the muscle tone, lean but strong, more developed than most boys of his apparent age. Not malnourished, Kessler remarked to Hart, though diet appears selective. Indeed, Mrs. Grady had already reported the boy's refusal to eat certain food. Stew, porridge, and milk were pushed away untouched. Meat, bread, and fruit disappeared in moments. Kessler made a note of it, then began testing for sensory reactions, holding up a candle to watch the dilation of the pupils, dropping coins to observe auditory response. The results were consistent, even remarkable. The boy's eyes reacted to light faster than Kessler had ever seen, and he could identify the direction of a sound with near-instant accuracy. It was when Kessler attempted to test for body heat loss that the first unsettling moment came. He brought a bowl of ice water, and asked the boy to place his hand in it. Thomas did so without hesitation, and left it submerged for several minutes, expression unchanged. When Kessler withdrew the hand and dried it, the skin was warmer, in fact, than before. The doctor stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Hart. This is not ordinary. The human body does not behave in this way. The tests continued over the next week. Kessler and Pennington both tried to communicate with Thomas, offering him simple English words accompanied by gestures. The boy learned them quickly, almost too quickly, but used them sparingly, as if reluctant to give away that he understood. He would say bread when offered, apple when shown the fruit, water if prompted, but never more. Questions like "Where are you from?" or "Who is your family?" were met with silence, or worse, with that strange other language. It was Pennington who first noticed that when Thomas spoke in his language, the room seemed to shift. Not physically, no rattling of windows, no change in the light, but there was an undeniable sense of pressure in the air, as if the words themselves were too heavy for the space. He mentioned it only once, over dinner at Mrs. Grady's, and was met with uncomfortable silence from the others at the table. The townsfolk grew bolder in their curiosity, some offering small gifts or treats in exchange for a word or smile, but Thomas showed no preference for sweets or toys. The only things that seemed to hold his attention were firelight and shadows, which he would watch for hours without speaking. On the 6th night of the examinations, an incident occurred that none of the doctors could explain. Kessler had brought a pocket watch into the room to test Thomas's sense of time. As soon as the boy's hand closed around it, the ticking stopped. Kessler frowned, thinking it a mechanical fault, but when he took it back, the watch began ticking again, steady as ever. He repeated the experiment 3 times with the same result. Electromagnetic interference, Pennington suggested, though he admitted it was an unlikely explanation. The boy, for his part, seemed amused, a faint glimmer of something like satisfaction crossing his face. Hart began keeping the folded paper with the strange writing in his coat pocket, feeling a growing reluctance to leave it unattended. Once he caught Thomas glancing at that very pocket, eyes narrowing slightly before looking away. By the end of the week, both doctors admitted they had no definitive answers. Physically healthy, Kessler concluded, but physiologically anomalous. Pennington agreed, adding only, "There is more here than medicine can explain." Hart didn't need convincing. In the quiet hours of the night, he found himself replaying every moment since the boy had been brought in. The unnatural stillness in the clearing, the language that bent the ear strangely, the way his eyes caught the light. There was something about Thomas Weaver that defied not just understanding, but categorization. He was not simply a lost child, and Hart was beginning to wonder if he was a child at all. If you want, I can now expand part 4 in the same rich, atmospheric style when the strange happenings in Elkins begin to escalate after Thomas's arrival. That's when the whole town will start to feel the weight of his presence. The first snow of winter had come and gone, leaving behind a brittle crust of ice that made every step through the streets of Elkins sound louder than it should. December was closing in, and with it came the long mountain nights when the dark felt heavier, closer, as if it pressed against the windows. It was during these nights that the town began to notice the change. At first they were small enough to dismiss: a lamp in the Grady boarding house flickering for no reason, the school bell rope fraying overnight despite no sign of wear the day before. But after Thomas Weaver came to town, the small things had a way of piling up until they could no longer be ignored. The first real whisper started with Old Man Crenshaw, who kept a small dairy herd on the edge of town. He was a light sleeper by habit, and that week he claimed to have woken to the sound of his cows lowing in distress. When he lit his lantern and went out to the barn, every one of them was standing silent and still, their eyes fixed on the same dark corner. Not a hair out of place. But the next morning, one cow lay dead, its body warm, its eyes glassy, no wound to be found. The day after, it was the blacksmith's turn. Eli Bartlett was hammering a horseshoe at the forge when Thomas passed by on his way back from the general store with Mrs. Grady. Eli swore the fire guttered low, almost out, though he had just stoked it minutes earlier. It took him 3 tries to coax the flames back, and even then they burned lower than usual, until Thomas was well out of sight. Miss Hollis, who had been among the first to gossip about the boy, claimed her pocket watch stopped the moment he stepped into her parlor to deliver a loaf of bread Mrs. Grady had sent over. When she showed it to him, he only tilted his head, watching her without comment, and the watch began ticking again in her hand. She sold it the next week. By mid-December, people no longer crossed the street to greet him. They crossed it to avoid him. Children still stared, drawn to something they could not name, but their mothers pulled them close and quickened their steps. Men at the tavern spoke in low tones about the hollow boy, and Winter Eyes, Sheriff Hart, still doing his best to keep the peace, began to feel the strain. It was his job to calm the townsfolk, but he could not deny the unease creeping into his own bones. He had seen the watch stop in Mrs. Hollis's hands. He had seen the blacksmith's fire die, and though he told himself these were coincidences, they clung to him like burrs in wool. The Reverend Powell tried once more to reach the boy, approaching him on the street with a Bible in hand. "You have a place in this world, lad," he said. "God made you as he made all of us. You must trust in that." Thomas said nothing, but for the briefest moment, he looked at the Reverend with an expression Hart could not place. Was it pity, amusement, Then he spoke a few words in his strange tongue. Powell went pale, shut the Bible without another word, and walked away. One night, a week before Christmas, a storm came in from the west, bringing with it an icy rain that froze as it fell. Mrs. Grady kept the lamps burning late, unwilling to sleep with the wind howling so loud. She had left Thomas in his small upstairs room, certain he would be asleep, or at least quiet, as he usually was after dark. But sometime after midnight, she heard the sound of bare feet on the stair. She stepped into the hallway with her lamp, and there he was, halfway down, eyes fixed on the front door. "What is it, boy?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached the bottom, placed his hand on the latch, and slowly he turned his head toward the far corner of the parlor, the same spot he had stared at in the sheriff's office. Mrs. Grady swore later she felt the temperature drop. The lamp flame wavered, though no draft passed through. Then Thomas spoke quietly, almost gently, in that same otherworldly language. She couldn't understand the words, but something in the tone made her skin crawl. He turned away from the door, climbed the stairs again, and shut himself in his room. When she checked the corner of the parlor, of course, it was empty. After that, Mrs. Grady took to locking her own door at night. The town's mood soured further when the Miller twins, 8 years old and prone to mischief, claimed they had seen Thomas standing in their yard well after midnight. Their father was ready to cuff them for lying until they described what he had been doing, standing barefoot in the snow, looking up at the sky without blinking. When their father stepped outside to see for himself, the yard was empty, but the snow was untouched. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. Hart tried to tamp down the panic, but the gossip spread faster than the frost. Even the practical men at the mill had begun to mutter that perhaps the boy wasn't meant to be here, that maybe he wasn't born like the rest of. Some whispered about spirits, others about curses, and a few dared to say the word witch under their breath. The final straw for many came during the Christmas Eve service at the small clapboard church. The snow outside lay deep and undisturbed, the night bitterly cold. The congregation was halfway through the second hymn, when Thomas, seated near the back beside Mrs. Grady, began to murmur softly to himself. Hart was close enough to hear it, a rolling cadence of his strange language, steady and then without warning every candle in the church went out. The only light came from the pale moon through the windows. Gasps and shuffling feet filled the darkness. Reverend Powell's voice trembled as he urged calm, and within a minute, matches were struck and flames relit. Thomas sat quietly through the rest of the service, saying nothing. When it ended, the townsfolk streamed out quickly into the snow, avoiding his gaze. Hart stayed behind, standing in the empty church, trying to tell himself there had been some draft, some trick of the wind. But the doors had been shut, the air still. The only thing that had changed was the sound of that strange language, echoing from the back pews. That night, as Hart walked home, he glanced over his shoulder more than once. The streets were empty, the snow unbroken, and yet more than once he could have sworn he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a pale shape there and gone between the shadows.
Snow fell in a steady, whispering curtain over Elkins, coating the crooked roofs and black iron fences in a soft white shroud. It was the kind of winter that made even seasoned mountain folk hunch closer to their hearths, where coal cracked and hissed inside cast-iron stoves. But in the Weaver household, the fire seemed to do little to dispel the creeping chill that had begun to infest the rooms. Not the kind that could be measured on a thermometer, but a slow, bone-deep cold that came from living under the same roof as Thomas. By now, even his most sympathetic defenders were beginning to question what they were sheltering. The winter had been harsh enough without the strange events piling like snowdrifts in the minds of the townsfolk. Mrs. Weaver confessed to her sister one evening that she had awoken to find the boy standing at the foot of her bed, unmoving, eyes fixed on her with that animal glint. He said nothing when she asked if he was all right, just turned and walked away. The door to her room had never made a sound when he opened it, and she swore she had locked it before going to sleep. She stopped locking it after that, not because she felt safe, but because she feared hearing the latch turn in the night. Others in town spoke of clocks. More than a dozen households claimed that their timepieces had stopped at exactly 11 minutes past 3 on nights when Thomas was known to be awake. A tinker from Buckhannon came to examine the mechanisms, only to find nothing wrong. The hands resumed their ticking the next morning as if nothing had happened, but the pattern repeated. The Weaver family's own mantel clock had frozen so many times that Mr. Weaver simply removed it, setting it in the barn to gather dust. Bellamy, who had been documenting Thomas's peculiarities, began keeping his own journal of dates, temperatures, and any incidents that coincided with the boy's presence. It made for disturbing reading. 3 nights where livestock were found dead without any sign of injury. 3 separate instances of lanterns guttering and dying though their oil was full, and an entry where Bellamy swore his own reflection lagged a second behind him in the window while Thomas was in the room. He had intended to publish a paper in a scientific journal, but the more he wrote, the less convinced he was that science would have the vocabulary to explain what was happening. Still, the scientists persisted. January brought with it a pair of visitors from Philadelphia, Professor Edmund Crane, a gaunt, intense man whose eyes darted about as though forever making silent calculations, and his assistant, a quiet young woman named Clara Price. They arrived with heavy trunks and a peculiar assortment of instruments: barometers, compasses, a glass sphere filled with some shifting, silvery liquid that Crane guarded like a treasure. Their stated intention was to measure what Crane called atmospheric deviations in Thomas's vicinity. The townsfolk might not have understood his terms, but they understood the way their dogs growled at Crane's equipment and refused to enter the Weaver home. The professor worked methodically, first observing Thomas from across the room while Clara recorded reading. The compass needle quivered and refused to settle when placed near him. The silver sphere darkened in swirling eddies when Thomas approached, though neither Crane nor Clara could explain what the change meant. At one point Crane reached out to take Thomas's hand and the boy recoiled, letting out a sharp guttural sound that sent Mrs. Weaver rushing from the kitchen. It wasn't a shout or a cry, it was something more primal, a sound like the first groan of ice breaking on a river. After that, Thomas avoided Crane entirely, slipping away whenever the professor entered a room. The avoidance seemed almost strategic, as though the boy understood what the instruments were for, and had no intention of being measured. This frustrated Crane to no end. On the 4th night, he devised a trap of sorts, positioning his devices in the hallway between the boy's room and the kitchen, knowing Thomas often wandered there at night. But the following morning the instruments had been knocked over, their glass shattered, and Clara swore she had seen a shadow move past her door without footstep. Crane wanted to press the matter further, but a sudden illness struck him, his skin turning pale, his breath shallow, and his heart beating in strange, irregular rhythms. He was taken to a boarding house to recover, and Clara packed the instruments without a word. It wasn't just the outsiders who felt the strain. Town life had grown tense, brittle. The Weaver family found themselves increasingly isolated, with neighbors crossing the street to avoid passing too close to their fence. Children were forbidden from coming to the house. Even the pastor, who had been among the first to welcome Thomas, began urging the family to consider the spiritual implications of keeping the boy under their roof. Miss Weaver clung to the hope that kindness might redeem whatever strangeness had claimed Thomas, but her husband grew quiet and watchful, speaking little except to mutter about things not meant to be here. In early February, the most unsettling event yet took place. A group of miners returning late from the Elk River shaft claimed to have seen Thomas standing on a ridge above the tree line, though the snow beneath him was unbroken. He watched them for several minutes before turning and walking directly into the darkness of the pine. One man swore his lantern flame bent toward the boy as though pulled by some unseen force. Another said the air grew warmer near him, even as frost crackled on their beards. They told the story in hushed voices at the tavern, and within days the whole town knew. It was around this time that Miss Weaver began to notice a change in the boy's appearance. He had always been pale, but now his skin took on a strange, almost luminous quality in the firelight. His eyes seemed larger, the irises swallowing more of the white. She thought he might be ill and tried to coax him into drinking herbal teas, but he refused anything warm, preferring cold water from the well even in the dead of winter. Once,
When she reached to wipe his mouth, she thought she felt a faint hum in his skin, as though some current passed beneath it. Dr. Bellamy, ever determined to document, visited again in mid-February. He attempted to measure Thomas's pulse but found it irregular, sometimes fast enough to be alarming, other times so slow he feared it would stop altogether. His temperature remained stubbornly above normal, hovering at a level that would have felled an ordinary child with fever, yet Thomas seemed unaffected. Bellamy left the Weaver house that evening pale and shaken, muttering that he needed to rethink everything he thought he knew about human biology. By now the house itself seemed to respond to the boy. Doors drifted open without the draft to move them, and frost formed intricate patterns on the glass spirals and symbols no one recognized. On more than one occasion, Miss Weaver woke to find the front door standing wide despite the bolt being in place. She began keeping a Bible on the mantel, not so much out of faith as out of desperate superstition. One night after a long day of biting wind and coal dust, Miss Weaver entered the parlor to find Thomas sitting in the dark, eyes reflecting the faint glow of embers. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge Mr. Weaver's presence, but the fire began to crackle louder, the shadows deepening around them. It was in that moment Miss Weaver realized he had stopped thinking of the boy as human. He didn't speak of it to his wife, but from then on, he kept a loaded rifle in the corner of the room. Despite the growing fear, there was a strange compulsion in the townsfolk to look upon Thomas, as though his presence was both a curse and a magnet. Men who had sworn to keep their distance found themselves lingering near the Weaver home, peering through windows under the guise of checking on neighbors. Women whispered in kitchens, half afraid to speak his name aloud, as though invoking it might draw his gaze. The boy moved through these days with the same quiet, inscrutable air, unbothered by the cold, or the tension curling tighter with each passing week. It was Clara Price, the quiet assistant from Philadelphia, who left the final note of the season's event. She returned alone in late February saying she had unfinished observations. The Weavers, weary but too polite to refuse, allowed her to stay. That night she sat in the kitchen with Thomas, speaking softly in a language no one recognized. Miss Weaver swore she saw a flicker of something in his expression, not warmth, exactly, but recognition. When Clara left the next morning, she carried no instruments, no papers, and she avoided all questions about what she had said. She only told Mrs. Weaver, "You should be ready. He doesn't belong to you." He never did. The snow continued to fall, but something in the air had shifted. The townsfolk began to speak less openly of Thomas, as though a silent agreement had been reached that his presence was not to be challenged, only endured. But beneath that silence ran a current of dread, a sense that winter was building towards something neither science nor faith could stop. The blizzard that had locked Elkins in its icy grip showed no sign of loosening, yet within the boarding house the air was thick with the restless unease of those who could not sleep. The scientists had decided that their window for meaningful observation was rapidly closed. Thomas had grown increasingly uncooperative, slipping into long stretches of silence, refusing food for days at a time, staring at the walls or at the snow beyond the windows as though he were listening to something they could not hear. Meriwether insisted that he was deteriorating physically. His pulse was faint, his weight had dropped to a dangerous low, yet the boy still moved with a strange, wiry strength whenever anyone tried to restrain him. It was Dr. Henslow who proposed the final series of examination. They had already catalogued everything measurable, his height, his pulse, his reflexes, but there were questions still unanswered, things that seemed to defy the realm of normal human variation. "If we cannot explain him," Henslow said one morning over black coffee, "we must at least document him fully before nature or whatever force governs him takes him from us." He glanced toward the boy sitting cross-legged in the corner, his face turned toward the window, pale light catching the glint in his strange, reflective eyes. The phrase "takes him from us" felt uncomfortably literal in the air between them. The tests began that afternoon. They checked his temperature again, still unsettlingly high despite the freezing drafts in the room. They pricked his finger for blood, though it was Dr. Meriwether himself who noted that it flowed more sluggishly than expected, dark and almost thick, and the boy never flinched at the need. They attempted to record samples of his voice with a phonograph, but the machine failed twice, once jamming completely, once producing a warped screech instead of speech. Dr. Lockridge muttered something about the resonance of his tone interfering with the wax cylinder, but even he sounded unconvinced. It was during the vision and hearing tests that the mood began to shift toward dread. Henslow stood at the far end of the hall, whispering phrases in English, French and Latin. The boy repeated them flawlessly, even when the scientist swore the volume was too low for any human ear to catch. Then, without prompting, he repeated a string of words none of them recognized, long, rolling syllables that seemed to twist unnaturally in the air. Merriweather, visibly shaken, insisted the sound was not a language at all, but a series of tones like a bird call. Yet the cadence was too deliberate, too human to dismiss so easily. By the 5th day of testing, tensions between the scientists had begun to fray. Snow had sealed the mountain roads, supplies were running low, tempers ran short. Some whispered that Thomas's behavior was deliberate, that he somehow knew they were trapped, that he was drawing out the ordeal for his own amusement. On the evening of the 5th day, one of the assistants, a young man named Fletcher, collapsed suddenly while attempting to measure the boy's reaction time with a pendulum. He came to a few minutes later with no memory of fainting, but swore he had felt a pressure in his chest, like being pulled downward into the floor. Thomas had not moved during the incident. He had simply stared at Fletcher with an unreadable expression, until Merriweather ordered the session ended. The blizzard broke briefly on the 7th morning, revealing a sky the color of old pewter. The town was still buried deep, but there was a pale light that hinted at the possibility of travel within the week. The scientists discussed whether they should attempt to move Thomas to a larger facility in Baltimore, where more sophisticated equipment could be used. Merriweather argued strongly against it. "If you take him from here," he said, "you risk never arriving. Mark me, gentlemen, he is tethered to this place in ways we cannot understand. Remove him, and you'll lose him." That night, the boarding house seemed wrapped in an unnatural stillness. The wind had dropped, yet the air felt thick and heavy. The fire in the parlor burned low, throwing restless shadows against the wall. Thomas sat by himself humming softly, a low, almost hypnotic sound that none of them had heard before. It was not unpleasant, but it carried a weight that made the hair at the nape of the neck rise. Merriweather asked him what the song was. The boy stopped mid-note and tilted his head, as though considering whether to answer. When he spoke, the words were in that strange rolling tongue again. Shortly after midnight, a sharp knocking at the upstairs door startled them all. It was not the main entrance, but the narrow door at the end of the hall where the snow had piled high against the outer wall. No one should have been able to reach it from outside. Fletcher, pale and trembling, volunteered to check. When he pulled the door open, there was nothing. No figure, no footprints in the snow, only the sound of wind rushing in from the dark. He shut it quickly, but the mood in the house had shifted to something taut and electric. They decided to end the night session early. Most retired to their rooms, though Merriweather lingered near the boy until past 1 o'clock. When he finally rose to leave, Thomas spoke one last phrase in the unknown tongue. Merriweather later said it was delivered with the cadence of a farewell. The following morning, the boarding house was in uproar. Thomas's bed was empty, the blankets undisturbed, as though no one had slept in them. The front and back doors were still bolted from the inside, the windows locked. Side, a fresh layer of snow covered the ground smooth and unbroken, without so much as the faintest imprint of a footstep. They searched every room, every crawl space, every shed on the property. There was no sign of him. One of the scientists claimed to hear that same low humming far off in the woods, but when they followed the sound it faded, leaving them alone among the snow-laden pines. The official report would later claim that Thomas Weaver absconded under unknown circumstances, but among those who had spent those final days with him, no one truly believed he had left by ordinary means. The samples they had collected, hair, blood, notes, were packed up for transport to Baltimore. Yet by the time they arrived, every scrap had vanished from the sealed crates. The phonograph cylinders were blank. The scientists parted ways within weeks, each carrying their own interpretation of what had happened in Elkins that winter. Some clung to the belief that the boy had been an unusual feral child, perhaps suffering from a rare condition. Others admitted, in private letters never published, that they could not reconcile what they had witnessed with any known branch of science. A few, Meriwether among them insisted that Thomas Weaver was never truly a boy at all. In the decades that followed, there were occasional whispers from the mountain communities. A strange child seen walking the ridges in the deep of winter, barefoot and untouched by frost. Livestock found dead without wound or struggle. The quiet, unnerving claim of a voice singing in the tree. But by then the scientists who had known Thomas were either gone or unwilling to speak of him, and the boy who could not be explained remained just another ghost in the long Appalachian memory. The final days of Thomas Weaver's presence in Elkins were marked by an oppressive tension that hung over the town like an unshaken storm cloud. It was as though the hills themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something unseen to happen. The snow had come early that winter, blanketing the narrow streets and sealing the forest in a quiet so deep that footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. The townsfolk went about their days with hurried motions, eager to return indoors before the long Appalachian dusk fully set. But there was an unspoken awareness that Thomas had changed somehow. Even those who had once dismissed the gossip now found themselves avoiding the boy's gaze, turning their eyes when he passed, unwilling to risk the feeling that he could see straight through to the marrow of their bone. Dr. Howell noticed it first, the way Thomas's eyes no longer seemed to track objects in the way most people's did. They didn't dart or follow movement naturally. Instead, they would remain fixed, unwavering, and yet still somehow know where everything was. Once, Howell tested him by silently holding up a medical tool behind his back, where Thomas could not possibly see. Without hesitation, the boy named it in his strange language, his tone calm and certain. Howell said nothing of the incident, but his hand trembled slightly as he set the tool down. The livestock deaths had slowed during the deep freeze, but something else began happening in their place. Clocks, whether pocket watches, wall-mounted timepieces, or the grand pendulum clock in the mayor's home, would occasionally stop the moment Thomas stepped into the room. This was dismissed as coincidence at first, until it happened 3 times in 1 week at the local church. Reverend Alden, already uneasy about the boy's nature, interpreted it as a divine sign. He began preaching that something unnatural had taken root in their midst, though he did not dare mention Thomas by name. Then came the dreams. Several townsfolk reported waking in the middle of the night with the distinct feeling that someone had been standing over their bed. They would swear they heard faint whispers in the same strange tongue Thomas spoke, the syllables soft but insistent, lingering in their ears even after full wakefulness returned. Those who experienced the dreams described them not as nightmares but as messages, half-remembered visions of forests stretching endlessly into darkness, and skies without stars. No one could explain why these dreams left them waking with tears in their eyes. The scientists, undeterred by the increasing hostility from the locals, continued their observations. Dr. Renshaw, the linguist from Philadelphia, had grown obsessed. He claimed that Thomas's language was not merely unknown, but perhaps unrecorded by any human culture in history. Yet it carried structures and cadences that felt eerily familiar, as though echoing something older than language itself. Renshaw's notes became frantic and scattered, filled with symbols that matched nothing in his previous work. His colleagues noticed his health declining, eyes sunken, hands shaking, but he refused to leave town. One night in late January, Dr. Renshaw went missing. His small rented room above the blacksmith shop was found in disarray, papers strewn across the floor, ink spilled in dark pools that looked uncomfortably like dried blood in the lamplight. No one saw him leave, and no tracks led away from the building. The only thing out of place was the fact that his journal, always kept locked in his satchel, was lying open on the desk. The last entry, written in a different hand than the rest, contained only 4 words in English, "Not from our time." After Renshaw's disappearance, fear deepened into something sharper. The townspeople began openly discussing sending Thomas away, though to where no one knew. Sheriff Mallory, who had long held his tongue, finally declared that he could no longer guarantee the boy's safety if he remained in Elkins. The suggestion was made to bring him to Charleston, where state authorities could decide what to do. Thomas listened to these discussions without apparent reaction, sitting quietly in the corner, hands folded, eyes half closed, as if already aware of every decision before it was spoken aloud. The night before the planned journey, the blizzard began. Snow came down in heavy, wind-driven sheets, rattling shutters and swallowing the sound of church bells. No one dared go out. In the morning, when the storm had passed, they discovered Thomas's room empty. The bed was neatly made, the blanket folded precisely at its foot. His coat and boots were gone, but so too was the heavy trunk in which he kept his few possessions. Sheriff Mallory led a search party into the surrounding woods, but what they found only deepened the mystery. There were no footprints, not a single depression in the snow, not even where he would have stepped from the boarding house porch. It was as though he had simply risen into the air and vanished. The searchers spread out, calling his name, but their voices only echoed back from the hill. Near dusk, one of the men swore he saw movement far up the ridge, a small figure standing at the tree line, watching silently. When he blinked, the figure was gone. Thomas Weaver was never seen again. In the months that followed, Elkins tried to forget. The scientists packed up their equipment, most refusing to speak of the case again. Reverend Alden's sermons took on a softer tone, though some suspected he still feared the boy's return. The dreams ceased, the clocks ticked steadily, and livestock deaths returned to their ordinary cause. But every winter since, when the snow lies heavy on the ridges and the nights grow long, some still claim to see a small figure on the edge of the forest, watching with eyes that reflect the light like a predator's. In later years, stories spread beyond West Virginia. Some said Thomas was a feral child raised by wolves. Others whispered of spirits that took human form. A few, recalling the strange note in Renshaw's journal, speculated that Thomas was not from any place or time known to men. These theories never found resolution, and perhaps that is why his legend endures. In the hollows of Appalachia, where the hills keep their secrets well, the name Thomas Weaver is still spoken in low voices, as both warning and wonder. And always the question remains unanswered: was he truly a boy at all, or something else entirely? Some mysteries settle into history like dust, fading under the weight of newer tragedies and fresher fears. Others refuse to be buried. The case of Thomas Weaver belongs to the latter. His name, whispered in back porches and around campfires, still unsettles the people of West Virginia's mountain country. The old men, who were boys when he walked their streets, still claim that on certain winter nights, you can hear that strange, lilting language echo between the trees, the words carried on a wind that freezes the blood. Science abandoned Thomas Weaver in 1874, unable to define what he was, where he came from, or how he left without leaving a mark. The official records close the file with a single unsatisfying word: vanished. But the hills remember differently. The forest keeps its secrets, and if you linger long enough beneath its black canopy, you might feel the air shift, hear the tick of a clock falter, and catch the glint of inhuman eyes watching from the dark. Some say he was never a boy at all. Some say he's still out there. And perhaps if the stories are true, he's been waiting.